My husband brought his pregnant mistress into our home on a rainy Thursday night, wrapped one arm around her shoulders, and looked at me with the kind of cold confidence only a coward mistakes for strength. "If you can't give me a child," he said, "someone else will." Then he kissed her forehead in my kitchen, the kitchen I had painted myself 3 summers earlier, while he stood nearby drinking beer and promising me we'd grow old together in that house. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just smiled, picked up my car keys, and walked out the front door. Because Daniel Carter had made one catastrophic mistake. He thought I was the infertile one. The rain followed me all the way down Interstate 88, blurring the orange highway lights into long, trembling streaks across my windshield, and somewhere between downtown Chicago and Naperville. I realized something strange. My hands were steady. After everything that had just happened, after the humiliation and the cruelty and the deliberate performance of it all, I wasn't shaking. I was exhausted. There's a difference. People think betrayal arrives like an explosion. In truth, it arrives slowly, quietly, like water leaking through drywall until one day the entire ceiling caves in above your head. By the time Daniel brought Kayla into our house, our marriage had already been dying for years. I just happened to be the last person willing to bury it. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old, and for almost 12 years, I worked as a pediatric nurse at Rush University Medical Center. I spent most of my days comforting frightened children and exhausted parents, and somewhere along the way I became very good at calming other people, while ignoring the slow disaster unfolding inside myself. Daniel and I had been married for 7 years. We met at a rooftop 4th of July party downtown. He was charming, ambitious, handsome in that polished suburban way women are taught to trust. He sold commercial real estate, wore expensive watches, remembered birthdays, tipped waiters well enough for people to notice. He knew how to perform goodness. And for a long time I confused performance with character. The first 2 years of our marriage were genuinely happy. We bought a narrow 2-story house in Aurora with white siding and blue shutters. We hosted barbecues in the summer, drank wine on the back patio, talked endlessly about the children we planned to have someday. Daniel wanted a son. He used to say it casually, laughing while he said it, but often enough that I noticed. A little boy, he'd tell people, future Cubs pitcher. At first, trying for a baby was exciting, hopeful even. Then months passed. Then years. Every negative pregnancy test felt like a private funeral. Still, I kept believing things would happen eventually. My gynecologist wasn't alarmed initially. Stress, work schedules, hormones, plenty of couples struggled. A few years earlier, I'd dealt with mild PCOS symptoms, nothing severe, but Daniel latched onto that information like it was a courtroom verdict. Quietly, subtly, almost invisibly, the blame shifted toward me. Not openly at first. Never openly. That's how resentment grows in decent neighborhoods with granite countertops and family Christmas cards. Nobody screams in the beginning. They simply sigh more often. They stop touching your hand in grocery stores. They stare too long at strangers pushing strollers. Daniel's mother, Patricia, made it worse. She lived in Oak Brook and carried herself with the permanent disappointment of a woman who believed life had somehow underpaid her. Every Thanksgiving she found new ways to wound me politely. "Maybe you and Daniel should stop waiting so long," she'd say while refilling wine glasses. Or, "My friend's daughter did IVF right away, no shame in getting help these days." One Christmas Eve, while handing out gifts beside the fireplace, she smiled at me and said, "I just pray Daniel gets to experience fatherhood before it's too late." As though I'd stolen something from him. Daniel never defended me. That was the beginning of the real fracture, not the infertility fears, not even the affair eventually, but the silence. A loving husband protects your dignity even when the world becomes uncomfortable. Daniel protected his own comfort instead. About 18 months before he brought Kayla home, my doctor recommended fertility testing for both of us. She said it gently, professionally, like someone used to navigating fragile egos. Daniel laughed the second we got into the parking garage. I'm not jerking off into a cup because some doctor wants to bill our insurance. I remember staring at him in the passenger seat, genuinely stunned. It's normal testing, I said quietly. For you, maybe. For both of us. His jaw tightened instantly. I'm not the problem here, Emily. That sentence became the foundation of everything that followed. He refused every appointment after that. Every conversation about fertility ended in irritation, sarcasm, or distance. Eventually, I stopped asking because I was tired of begging my own husband to face reality with me. And somewhere during that year, Daniel changed. Or maybe he simply stopped pretending. He became sharper around the edges. He criticized small things constantly. The groceries I bought, the hours I worked, the fact that I was always tired after 12-hour hospital shifts. He started staying late at the office more often. His phone turned face down on tables. He began going to the gym at night despite never caring about fitness before. I knew. Women always know long before they admit it to themselves. Still, there's a humiliating stage before acceptance where you become an actress inside your own life. You smile at dinner. You ask normal questions. You pretend not to notice perfume that isn't yours lingering on your husband's collar. Then one afternoon, about 6 months before everything collapsed, I saw her. Kayla. I stopped by Daniel's office downtown to surprise him with coffee, and through the glass conference room wall, I saw a young blonde woman laughing at something he'd said. She couldn't have been older than 27. Beautiful, in a loud, effortless way, perfect hair, expensive lip filler, tiny waist, all sharp confidence and curated social media charm. Daniel looked at her the way men look at women when they want to feel young again. When he saw me standing there, his entire face changed. Not guilt. Annoyance. That was the moment I truly understood our marriage was in danger. A guilty man still cares about your pain. An annoyed man only cares that you noticed. That night, he barely spoke during dinner. 3 weeks later, he started sleeping in the guest room because stress was affecting his sleep. And then came the Thursday night that ended everything. I had just gotten home from the hospital after losing a 6-year-old leukemia patient earlier that afternoon. I was emotionally hollowed out, already moving through the kitchen in scrubs stained with exhaustion, when I heard Daniel's car pull into the driveway. Then another car door opened. I looked through the front window and saw her stepping out beside him, one hand resting protectively on her stomach. Pregnant. My entire body went cold. Daniel walked into the house without hesitation, like he owned the right to destroy me publicly. Emily, he said calmly, we need to talk. Kayla stood slightly behind him, pretending to look uncomfortable, though not uncomfortable enough to leave. Then came the sentence. If you can't give me a child, someone else will. I remember the refrigerator humming in the silence afterward. I remember rain hitting the windows. I remember staring at his hand around her waist and realizing something almost unbelievable. He truly thought he was the victim. And suddenly, for the first time in years, I stopped feeling ashamed. Because 3 weeks earlier, after secretly seeing a fertility specialist alone, I had finally received my own test results. There was nothing wrong with me. Nothing. And if Kayla was pregnant, then someone else had been lying too. My sister Rachel opened the front door before I even knocked. She took one look at my face, stepped aside silently, and said, "Guest room's already made up." That was the thing about sisters. The good ones always knew when not to ask questions immediately. Rachel lived in Naperville with her husband and 2 teenage boys in a broad brick colonial, tucked inside one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods, where every lawn looked professionally trimmed and every garage door closed at exactly the same speed. Her house smelled like coffee and laundry detergent and safety. After the emotional chaos of my own home, the stillness almost hurt. I slept for 14 hours straight the first night. The next morning, I woke disoriented, staring at unfamiliar beige walls while rain tapped softly against the windows, and for one blessed second, I forgot everything. Then I remembered the look on Daniel's face when he wrapped his arm around Kayla. Not guilt. Victory. As though humiliating me had somehow restored his manhood. I lay there for a long time staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, and beneath the heartbreak, beneath the grief, another feeling began settling into place. Clarity. There comes a moment in certain marriages when love dies quietly enough for you to hear the truth underneath it. The truth was this. Daniel had spent years convincing himself that I was the problem because the alternative terrified him. And now an innocent child, possibly not even his, had become part of that lie. Rachel found me downstairs around noon sitting at the kitchen island, wrapped in one of her oversized sweatshirts. "You hungry?" she asked gently. "Not really." "That bad?" I gave a tired laugh. He brought her home. Rachel froze halfway through pouring coffee. "What?" "She's pregnant." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack glass. Rachel had never liked Daniel much. She tolerated him because I loved him, but even years earlier she used to call him performatively charming, which annoyed me at the time because it sounded pretentious and unfair. Now I realized she'd simply seen him more clearly than I had. "Oh, Emily," she whispered. I should have cried then. Instead, I said something that surprised even me. "I don't think the baby's his." Rachel blinked hard. "What?" I stood slowly and walked toward my overnight bag near the stairs. Inside was a large manila folder I'd packed in a rush the night before, not because I'd planned to leave, but because some instinct deep inside me knew I'd need proof eventually. I placed the folder on the counter and opened it carefully. Blood work, hormone panels, ultrasounds, fertility evaluations. Rachel scanned the papers confused. "I thought your doctor said." "She said I had mild hormonal issues years ago," I interrupted quietly. "Not infertility." I leaned against the counter and exhaled shakily. 3 weeks ago, I went back for complete testing. And I'm fine." Rachel stared at me for several seconds. Then her expression changed slowly from confusion to fury. "He never got tested, did he?" "Number." "Not once." I shook my head. Rachel muttered something under her breath that I won't repeat. The truth was almost embarrassing in its simplicity. After years of assuming the problem was mine after enduring Patricia's comments, and Daniel's growing resentment, and my own private shame, all it had taken was one competent fertility specialist to tell me something no one else had bothered saying clearly before. Healthy couples struggling to conceive should test both partners. Not just the woman. Dr. Kaplan had been kind about it. She sat across from me in her office holding my chart and said carefully, "Emily, based on your results, there's no medical reason you couldn't conceive naturally." I remember gripping the edge of my chair. "Then why haven't I?" She hesitated delicately before answering. "I strongly recommend your husband complete a fertility evaluation." That was it. No dramatic revelation. No cinematic twist. Just medicine, science, logic. But logic becomes dangerous when it threatens someone's ego. Daniel refused every conversation afterward. The one time I mentioned my results over dinner, he barely looked up from his phone. "Doctors miss things all the time," he said flatly. "Daniel, you're obsessed with making this my fault." "I'm not blaming anyone." "Well, you sure sound like it." Then he left the table halfway through dinner. At the time, I still thought we could fix things. That's the humiliating part of loving someone deeply. You keep searching for the version of them you first met, long after they've stopped existing. Over the next week, reality spread through my life like spilled ink. Daniel posted photos online with Kayla almost immediately. Dinner downtown, ultrasound pictures, captions about new beginnings, and finally becoming the man I was meant to be. People from our social circle reacted exactly how you'd expect suburban Americans to react privately, judgmental publicly, polite. A few women from church texted me vague messages filled with passive sympathy. "Thinking of you during this difficult season." One neighbor dropped off banana bread like I'd survived a tornado. No one asked Daniel difficult questions, because attractive, successful men rarely face scrutiny until after the damage is visible. Meanwhile, Daniel transformed into someone almost unrecognizable. The cruelty became deliberate now. He stopped hiding expenses on our joint account because he no longer cared if I saw them. Jewelry purchases, weekend hotel charges downtown, expensive dinners, a luxury SUV lease that turned out to be for Kayla. Rachel's husband Mark helped me contact a divorce attorney named Linda Moreno, a sharp, composed woman in her early 50s whose office overlooked the DuPage River. After listening quietly to my story, Linda folded her hands together. "Emily," she said carefully, "do you want revenge or do you want protection?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know." "Yes, you do." I looked down at my wedding ring. "I want the truth." Linda nodded slowly, almost approvingly. "Good. Truth is easier to prove than revenge." Over the next several days, Linda's office uncovered things that made my stomach turn. Daniel had been pulling money from our joint savings for nearly a year. Not huge amounts at first, small enough to avoid attention, then larger withdrawals. He used marital funds for vacations, gifts, apartment deposits, even cosmetic procedures for Kayla. But the worst discovery came 3 days later. Linda called me into her office and slid several printed bank forms across the desk. "Did you authorize these?" I stared at the signatures. My name. Or rather, Daniel's imitation of my name. My blood ran cold. He forged those. It appears so. The room suddenly felt too small. I kept thinking about all the years I'd protected him emotionally, while he quietly dismantled my dignity piece by piece behind my back. Linda watched me carefully. "This matters now," she said. "Not emotionally, legally." I looked out the window at the river below. Cars moved through afternoon traffic. People drank coffee outside nearby cafes. Somewhere, children were leaving school, couples were planning dinners. Ordinary lives were continuing untouched. And in that moment, I understood something important. The most dangerous lies aren't the ones people tell others. They're the ones they tell themselves. Daniel needed Kayla's pregnancy to be real because his entire identity depended on it. Without that baby, he wasn't escaping failure. He was exposing it. That night, I sat alone in Rachel's guest room, holding my fertility results in one hand and my divorce paperwork in the other. I thought about the years I spent apologizing for a body that had never betrayed anyone. Then I thought about Daniel smiling while humiliating me in my own kitchen. And for the first time since leaving home, I smiled too. Not because I was happy. Because I finally understood where this story was going. And Daniel Carter had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him. By the time winter settled over Illinois, Daniel had fully rewritten our marriage into a story where he was the wounded husband who finally escaped a cold, infertile wife. And people believed him. Not entirely, not openly, but enough. That's the ugly truth about public sympathy. It often belongs to whoever speaks first and smiles best. Daniel was excellent at both. He posted carefully staged photos online with Kayla every few days. Maternity shoots near the Riverwalk, expensive dinners downtown, blurry ultrasound images paired with captions about gratitude and second chances. In every picture, he looked triumphant, like a man who had finally conquered some private tragedy. Meanwhile, I became the ghost in the background of my own life. Neighbors avoided eye contact at the grocery store because Americans have mastered the art of polite discomfort. Friends stopped calling because divorce makes people nervous. It reminds them how fragile their own marriages might actually be. Only Rachel stayed consistently furious on my behalf. One Sunday afternoon, while we folded laundry together in her basement, she held up her phone and said, "I swear to God, if I see one more stupid post from your husband, I'm driving to Chicago myself." I glanced at the screen. Daniel had uploaded another photo. Kayla sat in front of a decorated Christmas tree wearing cream-colored maternity clothes, while Daniel knelt beside her holding her stomach. The caption read, "Some blessings arrive after years of heartbreak." Rachel looked ready to commit homicide. I surprised both of us by laughing softly. Not because it was funny, because it was pathetic. Daniel wasn't celebrating fatherhood anymore. He was performing masculinity for an audience. And performances always collapse eventually. The divorce proceedings became uglier after New Year's. Daniel filed first, which Linda assured me was mostly symbolic, but the petition itself felt like a slap across the face. Buried beneath the financial demands and property requests were subtle references to long-standing fertility difficulties within the marriage. Not explicit enough to qualify as defamation. Just cruel enough to humiliate me further. Linda read the document calmly across her desk while I sat frozen. He wants the house, she said. He's also requesting reduced spousal considerations based on financial strain related to fertility treatments. I stared at her. We barely even did treatments. I know. What financial strain? Linda gave me a long look. Emily, men like your husband don't build legal arguments around truth. They build them around image. That sentence stayed with me. Image. Daniel's entire life revolved around image. His tailored suits, his luxury watches, his expensive gym membership. The carefully curated social media persona of a confident suburban provider. And now Kayla's pregnancy had become the ultimate proof of his masculinity. Without that baby, everything unraveled. Linda leaned back in her chair thoughtfully. There's something else. What? Given the circumstances, we can request paternity verification once the child is born. I blinked. You mean a DNA test? Yes. I looked down slowly at my hands. Part of me still resisted the idea because despite everything, despite the affair and the humiliation and the lies, some stubborn piece of my heart still remembered the man I once loved. Then I remembered him kissing Kayla in my kitchen. If he's so certain, Linda continued quietly, he shouldn't object. She was right. 3 days later, Daniel absolutely lost his mind. He called me 6 times in a row after receiving the request from Linda's office. I ignored every call until finally he left a voicemail. You're embarrassing yourself now, Emily, he snapped. You're bitter, jealous, and honestly, this is getting pathetic. His voice sounded strained underneath the anger. Not confident. Threatened. I saved the voicemail. Then came Patricia. My former mother-in-law invited me to lunch unexpectedly at a restaurant in Oak Brook. Against my better judgment, I went. She arrived wearing pearls and disappointment as usual. For several awkward minutes, she discussed weather traffic, church renovations, the kind of meaningless conversation people use to avoid touching emotional landmines directly. Finally, she sighed. Daniel says you're making the divorce difficult. I almost smiled. That's interesting. Patricia folded her napkin carefully. Emily, I know this situation has been painful for you, but Kayla is carrying his child now. There it was. The quiet accusation beneath the sympathy. I looked directly at her. Did Daniel ever tell you he refused fertility testing? She frowned slightly. What? He never got tested, Patricia. Not once. That's ridiculous. It's true. For the first time in years, uncertainty flickered across her face. But only briefly. Because denial is hereditary in some families. Well, she said stiffly, regardless, what's done is done. Number. Not yet. Over the following months, Kayla's pregnancy became the center of Daniel's entire identity. He hosted gender reveal parties, posted nursery renovations online, talked endlessly about becoming a father. Mutual friends reported hearing him say things like, "Sometimes life gives you a second chance." Or worse. "I guess it just wasn't meant to happen with Emily." Each comment spread quietly through our social circle like smoke. And every single time I stayed silent. That silence drove Daniel insane. Because guilty people expect screaming. They expect revenge. They expect emotional chaos because chaos allows them to play victim. My calmness frightened him instead. By early spring, the baby was born, a little boy named Noah. Daniel posted photos from the hospital within hours. I remember staring at one image late at night from Rachel's couch. Daniel held the newborn awkwardly while Kayla smiled beside him, exhausted but triumphant. And suddenly, unexpectedly, I felt sorry for the child. Because innocent children always pay for adult vanity eventually. 2 weeks later, we sat inside a private mediation office in downtown Chicago. The room smelled faintly like coffee and printer toner. Rain streaked softly across the windows overlooking the city, and tension sat thick between everyone at the table. Linda beside me. Daniel across from us. Kayla near the corner holding a diaper bag. And 2 additional attorneys reviewing paperwork quietly. Daniel wouldn't look directly at me. He looked irritated, more than nervous, like this meeting was an inconvenience interrupting his new life. Then the mediator cleared his throat. We've received the paternity results requested by both parties. Kayla shifted slightly. Daniel exhaled impatiently. Can we move this along? The mediator opened the envelope. I will never forget what happened next. Not because of the words. Because of Daniel's face. Mr. Carter, the mediator, said carefully, the test indicates you are excluded as the biological father. Silence. Absolute silence. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Kayla stared blankly. Daniel blinked once. Twice. Then laughed. Not normal laughter. Sharp, unstable laughter. That's impossible. No one answered. He grabbed the paperwork violently, scanning the page faster and faster as color drained from his face. No, he whispered. No, this is wrong. Kayla suddenly started crying. Not dramatic crying. Terrified crying. I thought it was yours, she said shakily. Daniel, I swear I thought. You told me. I wasn't seeing anyone serious. Who is he? Daniel shouted. The baby began crying too. Chaos exploded through the room. And then Linda quietly placed another envelope on the table. Daniel looked at it slowly. What's this? Her voice remained calm. The court ordered fertility evaluation. Everything inside me went still. Daniel opened the file with trembling hands. I watched him read the words confirming what he'd spent years running from. Severe male infertility. Near zero probability of natural conception. The room became so quiet I could hear rain tapping against the glass. Daniel looked at me then. Really looked at me. And for the first time in years, the mask disappeared completely. No arrogance. No confidence. No performance. Just fear. Raw, devastating fear. You knew, he whispered. I held his gaze steadily. I knew there was nothing wrong with me. There's a particular kind of silence that follows public humiliation. Not loud silence. Not dramatic silence. A dead, hollow silence, the kind that settles over a room after truth finally arrives and nobody knows where to look anymore. That silence followed Daniel everywhere after the mediation. Within 48 hours, the entire illusion collapsed. Kayla moved out first. Not because she suddenly developed morals, but because panic replaced fantasy the moment money lawyers and reality entered the picture. She'd spent nearly a year imagining herself stepping into a glamorous new life beside a successful older man who adored her. Instead, she found herself holding a newborn baby while Daniel spiraled into rage and paranoia. According to mutual friends, their final fight was catastrophic. Daniel accused her of trapping him. Kayla accused him of using her to feel like a real man. Both of them were right. By the end of the week, she had taken the baby and disappeared to stay with relatives in Indiana. Then came the fallout Daniel never saw coming. Because betrayal alone rarely destroys a man's reputation in America anymore. But humiliation does. Especially male humiliation. Especially the kind tied to ego. The story spread quietly at first through text chains, neighborhood gossip office, whispers, church conversations after Sunday service. Nobody told it directly to Daniel's face, of course. Americans prefer indirect destruction. We smile politely while dismantling each other socially behind closed doors. Soon everyone knew. Daniel had cheated on his wife. Publicly humiliated her. claimed she couldn't have children, then discovered he wasn't the father after all. And finally, the fatal detail learned he was the infertile one. That last part traveled fastest. Because people are cruelest about the insecurities others try hardest to hide. Rachel called me one evening while I was finishing dinner. "You know, Patricia showed up at church crying." I closed my eyes briefly. What happened? Apparently, someone asked about the baby. I leaned back slowly in my chair. For years, Patricia had treated me like a defective appliance, quietly ruining her son's future. Now she had to face the possibility that the problem had never been me at all. Not only that, she had raised the man who destroyed his own marriage trying to avoid shame. A few days later, she called me directly. I almost didn't answer. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "Emily, could we meet?" We met at a small cafe in Geneva near the Fox River. The afternoon sky hung low and gray above the water, early spring still clinging stubbornly to the Midwest. Patricia looked older. Not dramatically older, just diminished somehow, like reality had finally introduced itself after years of being politely ignored. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, "I owe you an apology." I stirred my coffee without looking up. "For what?" Her eyes filled immediately. "For not listening." Simple words. But they landed harder than any dramatic speech could have. She admitted Daniel had finally confessed everything after the mediation, the refused fertility tests, the lies, the resentment, the affair, all of it. "He said he couldn't stand feeling weak," she whispered. I nodded faintly. "That sounds like Daniel." Patricia flinched. "You protected him for years, didn't you?" "Yes. And he blamed you anyway." I looked out the cafe window toward the river. "Yes. The saddest part wasn't the cheating. It wasn't even the humiliation. It was the realization that I had spent years carrying emotional pain for a man who would never have done the same for me." Patricia cried quietly, then dabbing at her eyes with trembling fingers. "You didn't deserve any of this." I didn't. But I also understood something Patricia didn't yet fully grasp. Daniel's real punishment had already begun. Because once the performance collapses, a person has no choice except to meet themselves honestly. And Daniel had spent his entire life avoiding that meeting. Over the next month, pieces of his carefully constructed life continued falling apart. His performance at work deteriorated badly. One of Linda's financial investigators uncovered additional misuse of shared marital funds, and although no criminal charges were filed, the scandal reached his firm quickly enough to matter. Clients grew uncomfortable. Colleagues distanced themselves. Then came the drinking. Mutual friends reported seeing him alone at bars downtown during weekday afternoons, staring silently into bourbon glasses, while sports played overhead on muted televisions. Part of me hated hearing those stories. Another part believed he deserved every second of it. Both feelings existed together constantly now. That's the uncomfortable truth mature people rarely admit out loud. Revenge doesn't erase love immediately. Sometimes you continue grieving someone while simultaneously watching justice destroy them. One evening in late April, I returned to Rachel's house after work and found Daniel sitting in his car across the street. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he stepped out slowly. He looked terrible. Not movie star terrible. Real terrible. Unshaven. Pale. Exhausted. Like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Rachel saw him too from the front window and immediately marched toward the door. "I'll call the police." "No," I said quietly, "it's okay." She looked unconvinced but stepped back. I walked outside. Cold wind moved through the trees overhead, while Daniel stood beside the curb with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. For several seconds he couldn't meet my eyes. That alone told me everything. Finally he spoke. "I lost my job." I said nothing. "They called it restructuring." He gave a hollow laugh, but we both know what it really was. Still, I stayed silent. Daniel looked up then, and what I saw frightened me slightly, not because he looked dangerous, but because he looked broken in a way I'd never imagined possible. "I ruined everything," he whispered. The honesty in his voice hit harder than anger ever could have. I folded my arms against the cold. "Why are you here?" He swallowed hard. "Because I needed you to hear this from me." I waited. And finally, after years of arrogance and blame and emotional cowardice, Daniel Carter told the truth. When we couldn't get pregnant. He paused shakily. I started feeling like less of a man. The words sounded painful coming out of him. Every time someone asked about kids, every baby shower, every holiday, I felt humiliated. And when your doctor suggested testing, he looked away. I couldn't do it. "You could have faced it with me." "I know. But instead you punished me for it." His face crumpled slightly then. "I convinced myself it had to be your fault because if it wasn't..." He stopped speaking. "Because if it wasn't my fault, then he would have had to confront his own fear, his own fragility, his own shame. And rather than face those things honestly, he chose to destroy the person who loved him most." Daniel wiped both hands across his face slowly. "When Kayla got pregnant," he laughed bitterly, "I thought it proved everything." "No," I said softly, "you needed it to." Tears filled his eyes immediately. That surprised me more than anything else. I had never seen Daniel cry. Not when his father died. Not during our fertility struggles. Not even during our separation. But now, standing alone on a quiet suburban street with nothing left protecting his ego, he finally looked human. "I'm sorry," he whispered. And for the first time in months, I believed him. But sincerity and consequences are not the same thing. I looked at the man I once planned to spend my life with and realized something profound. I no longer wanted revenge. Because revenge had already happened. Not through screaming. Not through cruelty. Through truth. "I did love you," I said quietly. Daniel closed his eyes. "I know. But loving you almost destroyed me." The wind moved softly between us. Then I took a slow step backward toward the house. And Daniel didn't try to stop me. A year after my divorce was finalized, I bought a small yellow house 20 minutes west of Naperville, near a public park filled with maple trees and walking trails. It wasn't large or particularly impressive, but for the first time in years, every room belonged entirely to me. No tension lingering beneath conversations. No silence stretched across dinner tables. No careful monitoring of someone else's moods. Just peace. Real peace. The kind you don't appreciate until you've spent years surviving without it. I painted the kitchen myself during early autumn, while jazz played softly through an old Bluetooth speaker balanced near the sink. Some evenings after work, I sat barefoot on the back porch with tea in my hands and listened to children laughing somewhere beyond the trees, and instead of feeling grief the way I once had, I felt something quieter. Acceptance. Not every life unfolds the way we imagine at 30. That doesn't mean it's ruined. At the hospital, things slowly returned to normal too. Rumors about my divorce eventually faded because America always moves on to newer scandals. Younger nurses stopped looking at me with uncomfortable sympathy. Patients still needed medications. Frightened parents still needed reassurance. Children still needed someone calm beside their beds at 3 a.m. Pain feels enormous when you're trapped inside it. Then ordinary life keeps moving anyway. One rainy Thursday afternoon, almost exactly a year after Daniel brought Kayla into our house, I attended a volunteer orientation for a local support organization helping women dealing with infertility, divorce, and emotional abuse. At first, I wasn't sure why I signed up. Maybe because surviving humiliation changes the way you recognize suffering in other people. Or maybe because after spending so long defending myself, I wanted to become useful again. The support center operated out of an old renovated church building in Aurora. Nothing fancy. Folding chairs, coffee stations, resource pamphlets stacked along pale walls. But inside those rooms, women spoke truths they had hidden for years. One woman described multiple miscarriages while her husband emotionally withdrew from the marriage. Another admitted she stayed with a cheating spouse because she feared growing old alone. A third confessed she had spent nearly 10 years believing infertility made her less feminine. I remember listening quietly and realizing how much shame women carry for things that were never entirely theirs to hold. Especially in marriage. Especially in America, where women are still quietly taught that nurturing everyone else matters more than protecting themselves. After the meeting ended, I stayed behind helping clean up coffee cups and folding tables. That's when I first met Sophie. She couldn't have been older than 6. Tiny little thing with messy brown curls and enormous cautious eyes, sitting alone in the hallway, coloring with broken crayons while her foster mother spoke with one of the volunteers nearby. I smiled politely while walking past. Sophie stared at me very seriously and asked, "Why do grown-ups always drink coffee when they're sad?" I laughed before I could stop myself. "That's actually a very good question." She nodded solemnly like we'd shared something important. Over the next several weeks, I saw her repeatedly whenever I volunteered. Her foster mother, Denise, eventually explained that Sophie had bounced between temporary homes for nearly 2 years after being removed from a neglect situation. "No one's officially pursuing adoption yet," Denise said quietly one afternoon. "People want babies. Older kids wait longer." Something about that sentence stayed with me all night. People want babies. Older kids wait longer. For years, I had measured motherhood through absence pregnancy tests, fertility fears, empty bedrooms, holidays filled with quiet disappointment. But sitting across from Sophie while she proudly showed me crooked drawings of dinosaurs and rainbows, something shifted slowly inside me. Motherhood wasn't ownership. It wasn't biology. It wasn't proof of womanhood. It was presence. Consistency. Safety. Love given freely without humiliation attached to it. Around the same time, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Daniel had started therapy. At first, I dismissed the information completely. Too little, too late, I thought. But gradually more details surfaced. He stopped drinking. Started attending support groups for men dealing with infertility and depression. Moved into a smaller apartment near Wheaton. Took contract work after struggling to find another corporate position. And apparently, according to Rachel, who still monitored local gossip like it was a competitive sport, he had become noticeably quieter. "Turns out humiliation builds character," she muttered one evening. I understood the anger behind her joke, but strangely, I no longer needed Daniel to suffer endlessly in order to heal. Because healing had already happened. Not perfectly. Not magically. But enough. Then one afternoon in October, a letter arrived in my mailbox. Handwritten. Daniel's handwriting. For several minutes, I simply stared at it resting on my kitchen counter, while rain drifted softly outside the windows. Finally, I opened it. The letter itself was simple. No manipulation. No dramatic declarations. No attempts to win me back. Just honesty. He wrote that therapy had forced him to confront how deeply ashamed he'd felt after years of believing he might never become a father. He admitted he had mistaken masculinity for control and weakness for honesty. He confessed that every cruel thing he said to me had really been a reflection of his own fear. Then came the sentence that stayed with me longest. "I blamed you because I couldn't bear looking at myself." I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside a drawer. Not because I wanted to forget it. Because I no longer needed to carry it around. Several months later, after countless meetings, paperwork inspections, and emotional conversations, I officially became part of Sophie's adoption process. The first night she stayed overnight at my house, she walked carefully through every room, like someone afraid the walls might disappear if she touched them too hard. "Which room is mine?" she asked softly. I showed her the small bedroom overlooking the backyard. She stood there silently for several seconds, staring at the pale yellow walls and bookshelf beside the bed. Then she whispered, "Really? Really?" That night, after she fell asleep, I sat alone on the back porch wrapped in a blanket while cold autumn air moved through the trees overhead. And for the first time in many years, I thought about Daniel without anger. Not because what he did stopped mattering, but because pain had finally stopped owning me. He lost his marriage, his reputation, his illusion of himself. And in the end, none of it happened because I destroyed him. The truth did. As for me, life did not return to what it once was. It became something better, something honest, something peaceful. On a quiet Sunday morning near the end of October, Sophie and I walked together through the park behind our house, while orange leaves drifted slowly across the path ahead of us. She slipped her small hand into mine naturally, effortlessly, like she had always belonged there. And suddenly, I understood something that years of heartbreak had never managed to teach me before. Family is not built through pride, or biology, or performance. It is built through love that remains gentle even after suffering. I looked up at the pale autumn sky and smiled softly to myself. Because losing Daniel Carter was never the tragedy I thought it was. It was the beginning of my life. If this story touched you in any way, take a moment to reflect on the people who truly protect your dignity when life becomes difficult. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not cruelty, it's healing, growing, and refusing to let someone else's bitterness define your worth. And if you enjoy emotional stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support truly means